Hello everyone, my name is Cassidy Griffin, and this is my podcast project for Music Tech. My project is a podcast on jazz throughout the Harlem Renaissance. I will be discussing the change in jazz stylistically, along with influential musicians and prominent charts throughout the time period. My impulse for focusing on this material is because, well, I've loved jazz ever since I could remember. I played trumpet in my high school's jazz ensemble, along with traveling to jazz festivals around the state. Now, I decided to take this opportunity not only to learn myself the history of jazz culture, but shed light on the topic as well, musician or non-musician. I've always wanted to know more about this topic, but I've never taken the time to do so. I have wanted questions answered, like, have jazz musicians of the past left stylistic fingerprints on jazz music today? And what motivated the greats in the jazz culture to keep pushing forward? Anyways, that closes my introduction. Let's begin. Jazz, a word that conjures a wide variety of styles in our mind, from the tight, swinging sounds of Chick Webb and his orchestra to the driving classic trumpet sounds of Harry James, to the soft, flowing sounds of Harry Carney and Duke Ellington's orchestra. What we know as jazz today is really a broad, contrasting range of styles. This variety of styles, cultures, and traditions was an explosion of the genre during the Harlem Renaissance. Jazz mainly consists of swing and blue notes, call and response vocals, and improvisation. Most people hail jazz as one of America's original art forms. As jazz propagated throughout the world, many different styles were created, such as New Orleans style began at the beginning of the 20th century, combining beguine, ragtime, blues, and improvisation. The 1930s brought us a more dance feel, with big swing bands, Kansas City style, and gypsy jazz. The 1940s toned down the dancing and brought us bebop, a more of a musician's music, which played at faster tempos and more chord-changing improvisation. Towards the end of the 40s, cool jazz developed with its slower, smoother feel and long melodic lines. Pre-Harlem Renaissance. The roots of jazz can be traced back all the way to the 19th century. There isn't much of a consensus or any documentation of the origins of the jazz genre, but most historians agree, however, that the style developed from these three main elements. Firstly, African rhythms were brought to America through the transatlantic slave trade. Secondly, black hymns and spirituals that were adopted by slaves in the 19th century. Lastly, the Afro-Cuban music that incorporated clave-based Latin motifs. With these influential elements flourishing and infusing together, it developed into blues and the earliest stages of what we know as jazz music. I have wondered how jazz music has evolved over the course of the Harlem Renaissance, so to give you a taste of the style before the 1920s, here's a piece when the roots of jazz were just getting planted. Here's Castle House Rag by James Reese Europe. It's important to note that James Reese Europe's band was the first black band to record commercially, which was a big deal at the time. James Reese Europe was also the leader of the African American music scene in the 1910s. E.B. Blake, another early jazz composer, called him the Martin Luther King of jazz. Mid-Harlem Renaissance. So how did jazz change during the Harlem Renaissance? How did it develop and why? A key contributor to the upending of jazz music that occurred in Harlem during the 1920s was a piano-playing bandleader by the name of Fletcher Henderson. Henderson really changed the jazz game of the time. What he did that nobody else had done was synthesize improvisational jazz style of New Orleans with the dance band tradition of New York. He also changed the entire definition of what a jazz band was back then. He organized the players into distinct sections, such as the rhythm section or the trumpet section. What was so great about the setup was that these sections could play melodies in a call and response style, or one section. The saxes, for example, would play supporting riffs while the trumpets would carry the melody. What Henderson created with these pioneering bands was the model for a big band that we still use today. Here's a little piece of what Fletcher Henderson and his orchestra played. What was so important about jazz during the Harlem Renaissance was that it brought attention to literacy and artistic works by African Americans. It was an important element in a developing appreciation for the African American community at the time. Jazz in the world today. Today in jazz culture, it is still highly recognized and still played today, in many ways more than one. Jazz today is split into three branches: traditionalists, contemporary mainstream, or anything goes jazz. Traditionalist jazz players stick with performing classic blues, bebop, swing, and exclude types such as free jazz and fusion mixes. They play what is known to them as real jazz and avoid the various mixes and add-ons to the genre. They also are known as jazz purists. Trumpeter Wynton Marsalis is the leading edge of this movement of traditional jazz. He is an internationally acclaimed musician who has played a major role in the revival of jazz today. Next would be contemporary mainstream jazz. These jazz musicians are mainly influenced by hard bop sensibilities. They use, for the most part, hard bop instrumentation and musical forms in their music. Beyond the hard bop structure, this subgenre is usually pushed forward by the artists. For example, increasing technical skillfulness and more difficult and complex chords and chord progressions. It also usually is deeper and expresses various emotions. Trumpeter Terence Blanchard is a popular and well-known contemporary mainstream jazz musician of today. Anything goes jazz involves putting anything into the pot and basically mixing it up. This can include all styles of jazz, classical music, world music, also known as music from South America, Asia, etc., all in any styles of blues, rock, Latin, funk, hip-hop, rap, and pop. A couple popular artists who include themselves in this jazz genre include trumpeter Dave Douglas and saxophonist Dave LeBeum. Big bands are still existing today, but not much in professional ranks. Very few exist today except for in America's schools. The list goes on for college and high school big bands. Repertoire for these bands consists of a range of styles, from traditional big band swing to arrangements of bebop, cool, hard bop, fusion, and funk as well. New arrangements are written and are played all the time, along with classics from the past. I wanted to get a perspective of what it's like for a college jazz musician in a big band, so I reached out to the lead trombonist in the Jazz Studio Orchestra at Western Illinois University to ask a few questions about what it's like for him as a jazz musician and his influences. Here's my interview with Mitchell Goldberg. Glad you could join me. So, what would you say it's like playing in a college jazz ensemble?
Being in a college jazz ensemble, it's very fun and very tiring. The group that I'm in is the top jazz group on my campus, and we rehearse for an hour Monday through Friday. And if we have concerts coming up, sometimes we'll have extra rehearsals like late at night. But I mean, those are worth it sometimes. But yeah, you get to play a lot, and sometimes we get to play some of our own compositions, not just the old stuff. But yeah, I really like playing. I've been in this jazz ensemble since my freshman year of college, and it's just a wonderful experience.
So, who would you say you idolize most in jazz as a trombone player?
Well, since I am a jazz trombonist, I do listen to other jazz trombonists as well. I really like Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, J.J. Johnson, Kay Winding, Slide Hampton, Frank Rosalino, Carl Fontana, Bob McChesney, Bill Watrous, Wycliffe Gordon. I could just go on, but those are the ones I'd recommend if you want to listen to jazz trombonists.
Lastly, as a musician, how has your appreciation for jazz changed over the years?
I've listened to jazz for most of my life, pretty much the big band and swing era, and I still listen to those to this day. When I started college, though, I developed an appreciation for other types of jazz, like, for example, bebop, Latin, modern jazz. I've been listening to those types ever since I started college, and I also like jazz from the very beginnings. Like, I like the Roaring Twenties as well. So, but you just gotta get inspired to like a certain type of style of jazz. Like, you can't just say, I'm gonna listen to this and try to and force myself to like it. You have to find something that motivates you.
In conclusion, jazz is a genre of music that will live on as a pure American art form, and still and will continue to inspire many musicians to come. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Maybe learned something, maybe not, maybe didn't care. Well, I had fun creating this, and I hope you enjoyed listening. Thank you.